sustainable food education, he's definitely helping shape mine. Please welcome Tom Philpott.
Thank you very much. It's a pretty amazing honor to be here and incredibly inspiring to be here among so many mentors and heroes of mine, and also new mentors and heroes that I've never even heard of before, who are enlightening me with these last couple of talks. And the overall theme that I see here that I find so inspiring is something that Carlo Petrini alluded to last night in his remarks, and that is the idea and the sort of necessity of reimagining our economy. And I was at Terra Madre in 2008 as well, where he was talking about that last night. It was a moment when Obama had just been elected, when Wall Street banks, I was a reporter on Wall Street before I got into food and farming, and I watched sort of gaping in awe as names like Merrill Lynch and Lehman Brothers sort of disappeared from the face of the earth. It seemed clear that the old economic models had been completely discredited. We had this new, vibrant, young president coming into office, and it seemed like a new movement was upon us. And unfortunately, rather immediately, the new president set about to patching up the old system, to reinvigorating the old system, getting it back on its feet. And here we are 5 years later, and corporate profits, sort of Fortune 500 or S&P 500 company profits are roaring back. Stock markets are at or near all-time highs in real terms. And of course, the unemployment rate is still, extremely high. Inequality has only grown since Obama came to office. There was just an article in the New York Times yesterday that said that the wealth gap between African Americans and whites and Hispanics and whites has grown since the financial crisis. And so we've seen things sort of get patched up again. And one of the thinkers that I go to when I reimagine, when I think about what our economy could be like, is, and even with for food and ag questions, like the questions that occupy my time, might seem kind of unusual. She's a 1950s and 1960s urban theorist, and I would say economist, although she didn't have a degree in either of those things, named Jane Jacobs. And most people know her book, The Death and Life of American Cities, but I think this book, The Economy of Cities, is equally important and amazing. And I want to say that Mary Berry's comments today and also last night are very well taken about that sort of emptying out of the countryside and the rural crisis that has become a kind of permanent crisis at this point. And so you might ask, why am I looking to an urban theorist to look at these questions? And I just want to make the point that there is no urban without rural, and there is no rural without urban. And obviously our cities aren't in very good shape either. Our city, people living in, most people live in cities now, and all the health metrics that we talk about, the diabetes metrics that Gary Navin mentioned today, those are urban residents being, this food system is failing them. And so urban and rural, we need to sort of reimagine healthy rural areas in conjunction with healthy urban areas, and they both need each other. In this book, The Economy of Cities, Jacobs praised what she called the valuable inefficiencies and practicalities of cities. And to illustrate her point, she invited readers to consider two examples from Victorian England, Manchester and Birmingham, or as she put it, efficient Manchester and inefficient Birmingham. A 19th century marvel widely held as a city of the future, Manchester represented a break from the past. What Manchester did that was so new and different was that it specialized. The city threw its lot behind one industry, and that was textiles. Jacobs refers to the stunning efficiency of its textile mills. By the 1840s, the industry dominated the city entirely. Jacobs tells us the industry was brutally competitive. Less efficient producers got swallowed up by larger, more streamlined players. Contemporaries were impressed. For boosters of this idea, Manchester's textile industry represented the triumph of the Industrial Revolution. For critics and detractors, including Karl Marx, who witnessed Manchester's boom period, he loathed the inequality he saw. He also deplored the dehumanization of labor, the need to force humans to behave like repetitive motion machines. But even Marx saw Manchester as a portent of the cities of the future, places that consolidate economic activity into a single industry, produce a single kind of product with terrible efficiency. Now, a little ways to the south of Manchester lies a city called Birmingham. By the mid-19th century, Birmingham looked like it was mired in the past. There was no one gaping at its terrible efficiency. It had a few relatively large industries, Jacobs tells us, but nothing to compare to Manchester's textile behemoth. What made its economy tick were its small operations. Jacobs tells us that most of Birmingham's manufacturing was carried out in small organizations, employing no more than a dozen workmen. Many had fewer. There was a competitive spirit in Birmingham, she says, but also plenty of cooperation. A lot of these little organizations did bits and pieces of work for other little organizations, she says. In other words, they worked together, they formed networks, loose and formal cooperatives. And unlike Manchester, there wasn't a lot of big fish swallowing up little fish. Birmingham's little organizations were not rationally or efficiently consolidated, she writes. There was a lot of waste of motion, duplication that could certainly have been eliminated by consolidation. In fact, organizations, and I think this is key, organizations were more likely to spawn new organizations than to swallow up old ones. Able workmen were forever breaking away from their employers, she writes, and setting up shop for themselves, compounding the fragmentation of work. She says few people took time to comment on Birmingham's economy, and those who did were puzzled that it worked at all. How can this possibly be working? Observers scratched their head about why the people of Birmingham weren't striving to imitate the emerging textile barons to the north. Jacobs didn't mention this, but I'll mention a key difference between the two cities. Manchester geared its economy outward to maximize trade, to import what it didn't produce, and export what it did produce, which was textiles. It strove to be the textile supplier to the British Empire and beyond. Meanwhile, humble Birmingham was mainly taking care of its own needs, turning to the outside world for trade only at the margins, importing what it couldn't produce, but producing most of what it consumed. Of course, as you probably guessed, things turned out quite a bit differently than most 19th century observers predicted. Efficient Manchester turned out to be a bust. In short, people in other places, namely in Britain's colony on the Indian subcontinent, learned how to turn out textiles more cheaply. The city's textile industry peaked quickly and entered a long, slow phase of decline. Manchester was built not for the future, but rather for its own obsolescence. Meanwhile, inefficient Birmingham thrived. Its fragmented and inefficient little industries kept adding new work and splitting off into organizations, some of which are very large but still outweighed in total employment and production by many smaller ones. She adds that by the middle of the 20th century, only two cities in England remained vigorous and prosperous. One was London and the other was Birmingham. Now, there are many lessons and analogies that we can draw from this tale of two cities. One obvious analogy for our time is Detroit. That one-time city of the future threw its lot with the automobile. And today, Detroit is hollowed out and economically depressed. Ironically, its greatest physical asset is not its rusted base of shuttered factories, but rather the prime prairie soil that it stands on top of. The revival of car manufacturing that's happened in the last couple of years has done nothing for Detroit. It's currently in bankruptcy. It's been taken over by an outside consultant. But while its car industry in the city, because most of the car production in Michigan is outside of Detroit, it all went to the suburbs. And while its industry lurches to oblivion, its community gardens thrive. Citizens are claiming abandoned land and using it to grow food at a time when cash is short. Pondering the city's budding farms, the great writer Rebecca Saltman recently went so far as to declare Detroit a kind of city of the future. She writes, Detroit may be a shining example we can look to the post-industrial green city that was once the steel gray capital of Fordist manufacturing. To me, Jane Jacobs' Birmingham-Manchester discussion provides a kind of uber fable for economic planning and development. Among his lessons is that cities and rural areas should not specialize in a single product, beware dominant streamlined industries, and nurture small interdependent businesses that tend to spawn new enterprises rather than swallowing up existing ones. And I think food actually, sometimes when I think about this stuff, I think, well, am I suggesting that food isn't food just one thing? Am I not suggesting that that cities and rural areas put all the way behind one thing? But actually, food contains multitudes. There's plenty of different, biodiverse agriculture has plenty of different things going on. There's plenty of different opportunities to add value. And so I think you can get a Birmingham-style economy by focusing on food. So the question is, how can we create Birminghams here in the United States, both in rural areas and in urban areas? And I can tell you right now, and I will be echoing Mary Berry when I say this, that the local food movement that most of us here are part of is vastly undercapitalized. And I'm talking about huge gaps in infrastructure, things like slaughterhouses, canneries, dairy processing. All of this stuff was abundant in the United States. And I don't want to go back to a lost paradise because the previous speaker just made clear there's a lot of problematic things in our past.